Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks what atheists should be doing next in a godless world. So far on the podcast, our discussions about atheism have mostly focused on times when atheists have been in the minority, in the centuries past when they struggled for basic rights and toleration, to the present when they are a growing minority, but still a disempowered minority. But what happens when atheists gain power? This was precisely the situation in the Soviet Union, a communist state led from Moscow that at its peak spanned from Eastern Europe through Central and Eastern Asia, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and ending with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Soviet Union was one of the rare cases of a state led by atheists. To learn more about it, we are excited to be joined today by Dr. Victoria Smolkin, an associate professor of history and Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies at Wesleyan University, and the author of A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism. Victoria, welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Maybe we can start just by having you tell us a little bit about your background. So I understand, I guess you were born in the Soviet Union, then at some point you moved to the US. So maybe you can just tell us about that.
Sure, yeah. I was born in the Soviet Union, specifically in Kiev, which is the capital of now independent Ukraine, then the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union. And my family left shortly before the dissolution of the country. So we left in 1988 and we moved to the US. And I do have a background in the region and a strong connection to the region. But at the same time, all of my education is in an American context and a European context. So it's interesting because I have obviously a heritage person's relationship to it. But I think it has given me a critical eye, maybe in a way that, it has allowed me to take up topics that I think a native person maybe wouldn't think worth taking up, atheism being perhaps the most obvious one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Were you brought up religious or atheist in Ukraine?
No, no, not at all. My family is Jewish ethnically, and I suppose culturally, but I didn't even know that until pretty much when we were getting ready to leave, in my recollection, it was something like, we're moving to America. Why? Because we're Jewish, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, kind of being like, well, what is that? Like, how does that mean? So, right. I think my family was a very typical kind of urban, upper middle class Soviet Jewish family, and that is very assimilated, 4 or 5 generations removed from anyone who spoke Yiddish or attended synagogue, So this is, it's a kind of, it's a typical story, and you instead believe in, Russian culture and, in secular culture more generally. So I really had no religious upbringing within the family. And then when we moved to the US, because we moved as, we were actually technically refugees that peculiarly enough were religious refugees because we were Jewish.
Right.
Yeah.
And because there was persecution, but it was persecution, I guess with Jewish people, it's a fine line, but there was persecution, ethnic persecution that was also could be seen as religious persecution because there was no outlet for Jewish religious life at all. Very, very narrow kind of spaces where people could be, could practice Jewish, the kind of be with among others doing things within the Jewish faith. I think Kiev had maybe one synagogue. I think there were maybe 30 or 40 in the whole country. So So yeah, so I think when we moved to the US, we were kind of under the umbrella of this kind of Jewish refugee community, and the American Jewish community took us in. And unlike us, the American Jewish community, which kind of sponsored this Soviet Jewish exodus, was profoundly religious. A lot of them, were conservative Jews, even Hasidic Jews. They, and if at the very least, very kind of culturally kind of practicing Jewish families. And so, I remember very distinctly kind of going to my first Passover Seder, and just being kind of confounded by
Right.
what
Right.
was happening, and then, kind of getting this message, like, this is what we do, So,
Yeah. Right. Right.
so
So,
that's the religious kind of background that I have.
yeah. And how much, I mean, that's a wild experience. How much of that experience shaped what you would go on to study?
It's hard to say. It's so hard to trace these things, because I think the most obvious answer is, well, it didn't really shape anything. I kind of came to this topic from a different direction, and certainly it was not something I was interested in until I went to graduate school and was thinking about big historical questions that did not have satisfactory answers. So it wasn't something that I felt, I wasn't kind of searching for a lost history either of my family or my country or anything like this. I came at it really from a kind of intellectual question or set of questions.
To take you back to grad school, then, what was your question?
Well, the question began, I mean, as these things do, they kind of turn into a series of questions, but it began in my kind of Soviet historiography seminars, where the way that Soviet studies was shaped, and it was shaped really within a Cold War American context. The study of the Soviet Union was fundamentally connected to and framed by this idea of this kind of totalitarianism framework. And, then everything that comes after is in some ways a revision to that framework, right? Or a kind of re-articulation of that framework. But this was, this kind of totalitarianism ostensibly was what made this country and what made the Soviet experiment unique and distinct. And the question, that by definition, there was, totalitarianism means a kind of monopoly over all spheres of life, ostensibly by the state or by the party. And if you think about that, kind of all of what that entails, and you break it down, all competing sources of authority have to be, marginalized and neutralized in order to actually be, a kind of working totalitarian model. And so when I was thinking about, Soviet life, I guess to some degree, as somebody who knows Soviet people and who came from there, this whole totalitarian framework just didn't really make any sense to me, because, that's just not how the Soviet Union was experienced. I mean, outside of the Gulag, right? And not everyone in the Soviet Union was in a Gulag. So so I kind of had all these questions about, okay, well, if there are these competing sources of authority, and if communism, according to this model, is like a political religion, right, which is this kind of, or kind of some kind of an ersatz religion, then what did they do with actual religious institutions and beliefs and practices? If it is a religion, then it has to kind of gain a monopoly, right, on and to exercise all other religions. And, I began to think of it from the bottom up, because, I think politically that question was pretty clear in terms of the Soviet state having, basically monopolized political power vis-a-vis religious institutions. But then thinking about culture and, everyday life and tradition, and thinking about, well, if everybody there lived their lives and organized their lives according to around religious institutions and culture, right? They baptized their children, they got married in the church, they had religious burials. Then how does that transformation actually take place? Is it, because it wasn't the whole the whole distinction was that you couldn't have a distinct private sphere, right? That's the totalitarianism. So you couldn't be Soviet in public, but religious in private, right? So that's kind of where I was looking and trying to understand what actually happened to religion and what did they offer in return? How did they actually try to create this kind of more robust socialist experience?
Yeah, that's great, right? This transformation, and that, like, in your book, the whole thing, it's constantly transforming itself. For us, one of the things that we've talked about on the podcast a couple times now is secularism and this move to secularism, and it's strange how it's happening. But it's also coming from a place where, when we were talking about the differences between French and Anglo-American versions of secularism,
Mhm.
they kind of start with this church and state divide, and they enact it in different ways, and it has different legal ramifications. But what existed before the Soviet Union during Imperial Russia is probably very different from the way we conceive it in the sort of industrialized West. What was the relationship between the church and the state in Imperial Russia before the Bolsheviks? And what were if you could just talk a little bit about how that informed that everyday cultural life that the Soviets tried to transform? I know that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and let me try to tackle it as succinctly as I can. I think this question that or this idea of, to what degree can we compare these experiences? To what degree does the kind of Western experience shape or in some way inform the Soviet experience? I think it's a really important one, and one that people are still, I think, kind of trying to think through, including myself. But I think what makes this distinct, right, the Russian imperial and then later Soviet case, is there was not really a strong kind of free thought secularist movement before the revolution. In as much as there was, it was completely tied into the political sphere, right? Into socialism and populism, all of the kind of political revolutionary movements. So there wasn't this kind of, to borrow the Soviet term, quote unquote bourgeois secularism, right? Which is kind of cultural and not revolutionary in its essence. So what you have, and I kind of begin the book in this way, is that the Soviet Union, it wasn't kind of mapping onto a blank slate. Right? It was mapping onto a very particular and peculiar religious political formation, the Russian Empire, which was still in 1917 a confessional state. It had no secular bureaucracy to do the kind of things that people in, Germany and France and Western Europe more broadly, England, were kind of contesting. For example, civil registration of marriages, right? Things like that became
Okay.
an issue for secularists, right? To take these things out of the church. In the Soviet Union, up until the revolution, this was all done through religious institutions, and they also collected. I mean, they kept the census, right? They recorded births, marriages, and deaths. They were the primary social mechanism of kind of social control, in as much as they were embedded in communities. So there wasn't really a kind of robust secular culture outside of this, quite refined intellectual sphere. And when the Bolsheviks seized power, one of the very first things they did was to create, before they even thought about atheism, one of the first things they did was to create precisely the kind of secular infrastructure that already existed in the West, namely separation of church and state, taking religion out of education, creating this kind of bureaucratic infrastructure for managing the population, births, marriages, and deaths, and civil acts. So they actually were, kind of overnight kind of went through this entire process that had been going on over the course of several decades in the West.
Right, like an overnight secularization of
Yeah.
administration.
Quite literally, yeah. Overnight secularization where, basically with a decree, priests were no longer, a church marriage was no longer considered legal, right? You could still have, have the ceremony, but you also had to go to register it. And until the state recognized it and register it, it wasn't, in the eyes of the state. So yeah, it was overnight secularization, but very much a secularization, not a kind of, and now everyone is atheist,
Right. Yeah. One of the things Todd and I were talking about just before the podcast started, I mean, like, we were talking about how the Soviet strategy to religion and to atheism sort of ebbs and flows over the 20th century. But was it actually ever illegal to be religious in the Soviet Union?
Broadly speaking, no. Broadly speaking, and this is, I think, something that gets lost in discussions and histories of this aspect of Soviet history, is technically, legally, freedom of conscience was in the Soviet Constitution from the beginning to the end. And it was articulated pretty much in the way that it's articulated in other constitutions. There was nothing peculiar about it, right? That people can have beliefs, can have whatever religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs. That it's all kind of, the state is neutral on these issues. But of course, what is peculiar to the Soviet case is that, yes, the state is neutral on these issues, but the party is not, and it's a
right. Okay.
so it's, on the one hand, a kind of secular, neutral, quote unquote, state, right? Like France or like, the US in some way. But on the other hand, it's also a state that's kind of, in which the party that has a monopoly on power is explicitly committed to an atheist platform.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was a kind of contradiction in that system from the beginning. And then I should also say, and this is important, is that, in principle, religion was never outlawed or made illegal. In practice, there were certain religions that were actually outlawed, right? That were actually, not, and they were, for example, the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, they just were outlawed. So their property was transferred to the Russian Orthodox Church, and then basically they continued to practice, but under the auspices of this Russian Orthodox Church, and kind of in the called catacombs, or Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Another example. So, so there were kind of, when you were religious in a way that violated this clear secular framework, right, between the private and public, between, you in any way threatened to, quote unquote, kind of contaminate the population, right, with your religion.
Right.
That was, or positioned yourself against Soviet power, right? Explicitly, like somebody like a Jehovah's Witness is explicitly saying, I will not participate in Soviet institutions, right? So that from that perspective, they're not being persecuted for being religious. They're being persecuted because their religion forces or kind of dictates that they position themselves against the regime, right? So,
yeah. But so in the first phase, sort of like phase that you discussed, the Soviet state does move against churches, though, right? They don't act as a neutral party. They're actually militant atheists early on. Is that correct?
Yes. So the militant atheists really come into the picture a bit later, not immediately after the revolution.
Okay.
They really show up in the mid 1920s.
All right. So how does that come about? I mean, it's to what extent is in the period of the revolution or the Civil War, how much is the Orthodox Church, which I think is the main contest that's set up? How much of a threat is the Orthodox Church to the nascent Soviet state?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an enormous threat. When the Bolsheviks come to power, they're basically they're basically a coup, right, that seizes power, and they're a minority, not just within the Soviet society, but they're a minority, or within the kind of political spectrum, but they're a minority even within the socialists, right? So
Right.
kind of the most radical sect, right, of this of the political spectrum seizes power, and what it's facing, right, in its opponents is not basically everyone who is to the right of them, which is pretty much everyone,
Right.
you know. And
Yeah.
and all the way to the right, you have the kind of the monarchists, and the church is, kind of some, moving through that spectrum, but certainly is right leaning, right, because it is an establishment institution. So they found it very threatening. Now, it's worth saying that there were real reformist elements within the church itself. So, the church was not a monolithic structure. There were reactionaries within the church, and there were reformers within the church, just as there are within any religious institution. So there were these modernizing elements within the Orthodox Church, but on the whole, the patriarch of the church, anathemized the Bolshevik regime and basically, dictated the position of Russian Orthodox people vis-a-vis the Bolsheviks. And that's pretty much the majority of the people, right? So it's an incredibly threatening institution in that it can mobilize public opinion against this quite peculiar revolutionary party. And what they discover in the course of the first years is, initially they have kind of much bigger fish to fry, so to speak, right? So they're, basically go from a revolution and seizing power to fighting an all-out civil war, against everyone who believed them to be illegitimate. And that civil war continues for 4 years, right? That's what you forget, is if you kind of think of the Civil War as a continuation of the revolution, then, the revolution's not really over. And in the course of the Civil War, their policies lead to all sorts of things, famine being one of them. And what they do is they see this as an opportunity to really to deal a blow to the church. And so they say that they're going to sell off the church's property to fund famine relief. And of course, the church is in this peculiar, situation, because they can't really argue against famine.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, they recognize that this is really bad for them. And so the patriarch tries to negotiate that, yes, they'll sell off the property, but let the church be in charge of the process. And of course, the Soviets are not for it. And then they arrest the patriarch. And so it's over these issues of power and autonomy that the church really becomes much more clearly a kind of opponent to the regime. And more importantly, an opponent that the Bolsheviks take seriously, because initially they don't really take it that seriously. They kind of think that the church will kind of take care of itself, since it no longer has a kind of imperial regime to support it, right? And so that's where, and it's when the church kind of puts up a fight or tries to maintain some kind of autonomy, and not only that, but mobilizes local communities, right, to against the Bolsheviks, right, who are coming and trying to seize their religious property. This means that their power is political, right? They have actual political power that I think the Bolsheviks had not really recognized. And if they recognize that, then they become a real political enemy. And so that does not happen until the kind of early 20s, and then they start this kind of two-pronged fight against the church. On the one hand, much stricter administrative and juridical measures, right, to contain them. What basically is setting up what they can and can't do. And then the other is bringing in atheism, right? So kind of rolling out a major propaganda campaign to explain to the masses why they should not follow the church.
It's interesting just because, I mean, just sort of what you were mentioning earlier about the question about totalitarianism. And I mean, it definitely wasn't the case that the Soviets could just sort of snap their fingers and everyone's an atheist. I mean, they really sort of had to struggle to try and convince the population, and usually not completely successfully. Maybe you can just talk about like how, like what strategies they use to try and convince people of to become atheists, I guess.
Sure, yeah. That's a great question. And, it is remarkable to me that there is this kind of latent and not really articulated perception that, the Bolsheviks seized power and snapped their fingers and everyone's an atheist. I think there is actually this it's just kind of an assumed part of the package. And that, in a way, was what I was trying to write against, because it's a bit absurd to even, think about this if you think about it as a kind of as an historian, right? If I walk into my town and declare myself mayor, and I have, 5 of my friends,
right.
It doesn't really, you will be taken to the madhouse, right? So it's not that things just don't work like that. You don't just seize power and transform an entire population, without a long and protracted struggle. And so this struggle, that's what I'm trying to map in the book, and it goes on for decades. But the first stages, where they're kind of trying to articulate what it means to be atheist and why it's important for Soviet people in particular to be atheist rather than religious, and how that's connected to the larger communist project, right? They have to actually explain this to people, because it's by no means clear to a person why, if they don't have a problem with Bolshevism in power, why that should mean that they can't baptize their child.
Right.
Right. Like, that's actually by no means obvious. And these people are not at all versed in Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. So this all has to be made explicit, articulated, and then inculcated, right? And the way that this is done is, of course, in part through education, but of course, who are the teachers? It's not like they just got a bunch of new atheist teachers. The teachers are the same teachers that were there before.
Yeah, right.
Who taught, right? And so this is the thing that I think somehow gets lost in all of this is, and these teachers don't really know what it is that they're supposed to be teaching. What does it mean to teach atheism, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so instead, they just basically don't do anything, right? They just take religion out of the curriculum, but they don't kind of do atheist propaganda in school in any way. So then atheist propaganda becomes really the purview of, for lack of a better term here, these kind of civil society organizations, but they're not, maybe social organizations is a better way of putting it, like the League of Militant Godless, right? So it becomes kind of the purview of enthusiast societies that come together, to hold events, to, educate people in readers clubs, and to have anti-Easter parades, right? And these kinds of, and something I talk about in the book, the most kind of, let's say, the least distasteful of these tactics was, and the least kind of, let's say, socially problematic, because nobody liked the Easter parades or anti-Christmas parades, was scientific enlightenment, right? Because they kind of adopt this enlightenment narrative in which the world is wonderful, is full of wonder already, right? There need to be miracles, because if you actually think about the world and how it works, and astronomy and physics, it's already this kind of wondrous, wonderful place. And this is the kind of the new narrative. And they're saying, and not only that, it's science that's aligned with progress. And if we want this country to be modern and progressive, then we need to embrace the scientific worldview. And if you look at the church, it's always been against science, against progress, against, it's always supported the forces of reaction. So then you have morality plays about Giordano Bruno and, Galileo, and all this kind of, this kind of conflict, this kind of, conflict between science and religion over the century, to try to communicate to people the basic message that to be progressive and to be modern and to be enlightened is to be atheist.
Mm. So that's neat. It sounds like they at first outsourced it to, I like how you put it, enthusiasts. And but then the thing that stands out with the idea of science and progress, that's not necessarily communistic or socialist. Just tying it to progress, you can do that. That's a bourgeois narrative as well, right? Science is
Yeah.
progress.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and that's the thing is they actually, if you think about who these early enthusiasts are, they are really kind of, I mean, they are bourgeois, right?
Oh, right.
And they are actually, they're committed socialists, but they're kind of, they believe in enlightenment, right? They believe in science, they believe in progress. And I don't think that in a way, the Soviet project is a variant of this narrative. It's not that it's something other than the liberal, progressive, modern project. It's just, so I think it's within this kind of broader story of modernity, and it's conveying that. It's just that it's also conveying two other aspects. One, that, these reactionary institutions have always stood in our way, and, and therefore we have to overcome them. And two, that actually this isn't just about kind of being enlightened, that actually the political project itself hinges on the success of our kind of transcending this backwardness. So it's not a private matter now. It's a public and a political matter, what kind of worldview you have.
Right. Okay. So that adds a new dynamic to it that feels different than like the American phenomenon. But,
Mm-hmm.
so during this time, this earlier part, this goes through the 20s and up through the Great Patriotic War, World War II. Is the state still seizing lands? Are they shutting down religious institutions? Is there an explicit state-led legal or extra-legal action
Yeah.
that's militating against them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that continues through the 20s and the 30s in waves. In terms of the secularization of property, that was mostly done in the very first years after the revolution. But, so that then the churches basically, rather than owning the institute or the building, right, they technically rented it from the state.
Oh,
So
wow.
that had already happened, very
Yeah.
early on. So this kind of mass secularization.
So
And
an
then,
atheist state rents their property. Wait, an atheist communist state is renting property to churches. That
well, it's no,
that
because
sounds crazy.
no, but no, Todd, it's not crazy because it's not an atheist state. It's
Yeah,
a
that's true.
secular
It's
state.
Yeah,
okay.
that's right.
Secular
That
Yeah.
state with an atheist party.
Atheist. Yeah, right.
with the
Right.
atheist
And
party.
that distinction is really important because the people who are
Yeah.
doing the kind of administrative work are,
Uh-huh.
they are both kind of acting under the political platform of the party, but they're not just kind of expropriating everyone and turning everyone
Mm,
atheist. They are trying to operate within a certain kind of secular legal infrastructure. So, from that perspective, they didn't outlaw religion, but they are
right.
taking church property and
Yeah.
they're basically like leasing it to these churches for not very much money, actually. That's actually, it wasn't, it was basically a way of expropriating them, but without causing kind of a huge disruption to their activities.
But still allowing them to
Yeah,
exist.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then the next stage is when you go and you close the building itself, right?
Okay.
That
Yeah.
that is, but that, this wasn't all done. It wasn't like the October Revolution happened and then, within a year all the churches were closed and all the property was of the state. This actually, first there was this kind of transfer of ownership of the property. Then, but people from their perspective, they're just continuing to go to church as they always had. They don't know, kind of who owns the building. Then, a decade later, in a new wave of administrative regulation and repression, a church might be closed right? And it,
Mhm.
and just shuttered. And
Mm.
because the state owns the building, it can do that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it just literally saying you can't go in here. And so
Yep.
and so if you kind of think about that process in its component parts, it's actually not as strange as it might seem, right? Because they can't, if a regime like the Bolshevik regime had come in and in one day tried to overturn every single
Yeah.
Yeah.
aspect of everything, they would have never been able to stay in power.
Hmm. It seemed, I mean, just to sort of move the story along, like eventually there were starting to be the creation of like atheist rituals to try and lure people away from the churches and so on, like atheist weddings and so on, I guess. So maybe you can just talk more about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was, that was kind of part of as I said, there's kind of it was a two-pronged attack, right? One was to kind of diminish the sphere of religious life and really kind of confine it to basically liturgy in church. And then the other was to expand the sphere of the secular and the atheist. And to kind of create a kind of secular atheist culture, including this was the first wave of this was in the late 20s and 30s, these what they called red rituals, right? So red weddings, red baptisms, red funerals, and in that period, that this really was not something, again, it was really the purview of a kind of group of activists and enthusiasts, and was not widely practiced at all, but it was widely publicized, right? Because these enthusiasts had a monopoly on the press, right? So,
Right.
and also, were executing the party line, so to speak, right? So you heard a lot about them, but if you actually look at how often they happen, not very often at all. And so the rituals as a really existing transformation in Soviet society don't really take place until much later, until the end of the 50s, when the state actually creates a real apparatus, a kind of infrastructure, not just for registering these events, which it had. So instead of a ritual, the Soviet way to get married was to show up in a civil registry office and sign a piece of paper.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
And there was no ritual at all. There was
Right.
Mm.
and then, the person behind you would be registering their divorce, and the person after that would be
Yeah.
registering
Right.
the funeral.
Right. Yeah.
So at some point, right, they realized that that's probably not a great way of creating a secular
Yes.
culture.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the first thing they do is they separate. They say, okay, the weddings, the happy occasions, and the birth rituals need to go to a different place.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they create, specific rituals, and their specific ritual spaces, the so-called palaces of weddings, and people wear special costumes or special garb to make the solemnity of the ceremony more pronounced. There's music, there's costumes, there's food. So this really becomes a project that is widespread and has a kind of infrastructure to support it, really in the 60s and 70s.
And then did it immediately die out?
That's a really great and really interesting question, because the answer is no, not really. They didn't really die out. The so-called Soviet wedding, which was created basically in the course of the 60s in various ritual committees that sat down and said, okay, well, the person doing the ceremony should wear this outfit, and the building should look like this, and part of the ritual will be going through the city and going to important locations and laying a wreath at the
Mm.
monument to the war, and all of this kind of ritual part of it, which was actually created within the infrastructure of this kind of atheist ritual project, that's continued, right? Because that people to this day, they have palace of weddings, they have
Right.
weddings at the palace of weddings, and then afterwards they go around
Wow.
and do this ritual. But what's interesting is they're not aware, and they really weren't aware even in the late Soviet period, that this ritual had been just recently,
Ah, right.
Mm.
So from that perspective, the wedding ritual was actually incredibly successful.
Wow. Can we go back just a little bit on something you said?
Sure.
Did you say the ritual committee?
Oh yeah, yeah,
So all of this is being designed in bureaucratic committees.
correct.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the totalitarian nightmare that
Well,
you have to.
I mean, look, I was saying, to Nathan that, well, how else would it be designed? I mean, there's no other kind of
Mhm.
infrastructure for
Yeah,
this.
that's true. Yeah.
Right.
And that's why the rituals themselves can end up a bit monstrous, right? Because anything that you create by committee, right, is
Yeah, right.
kind of a
Yeah.
parody of itself in the
Yeah,
making,
right.
right?
Yeah.
But as I was saying to Nathan,
Yeah.
when this project returned, unlike the early Soviet period when it's really kind of in these extra governmental institutions like the League of Militant Godless, right, which is nominally not part of the party or the state, it's a social institution or a civic organization. When this comes back, the ritual committees are actually within state structures, right? So it's actually
Hmm.
the Ministry of Justice, for example, that forms a committee to create a Soviet wedding ritual because
Wow.
the
Yeah.
civil office that registers the weddings is in the under the Ministry of Justice, right? So it's this kind of peculiar thing. And then, and of course there's variety because in Ukraine, for example, they actually, that for there, this problem, the kind of religious question or the religious problem is so acute, much more so than in Russia because it's on a border, it's a border area. It has much higher rates of religion. There, they actually form a committee within the government structure, kind of an ad hoc committee, right? That whose only purview is to work on this.
Do we have any idea about I mean, how successful the atheist campaign was over the course of the Soviet Union? I mean, in terms of the actual numbers of believers and atheists, do we know about that?
Well, it depends really on how you define success. Um,
Hmm.
you know,
Right. Yes. Right. I guess let's say from the Soviet perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of two definitions of success that we can go by, even from the Soviet perspective. One is, the kind of secular, did Soviet society secularize or did it become secularized? Meaning, did religion become essentially a private affair with most people not seeing it as a central guiding principle of their life or a central component of their life? I think from that perspective, you could say, yes, Soviet society by the 70s and 80s, and I talk about this in the book, that's kind of where the book ends up, is largely indifferent to religious questions in as much as, there's a commitment to the kind of cultural aspects. But for the most part, a lot of people, and I'm not talking here again, of course, it's such a huge country, so it's hard to generalize. I'm not talking about, religious dissidents, for example, right? Who were completely committed to their religion and became even more so in the late Soviet period. But in the aggregate, right, most people were just not, this just was no longer a central part of their worldview and their interests. On the other hand, so that's one way of kind of measuring it. So, how many people were religious? Well, depending on if you are asking about belief in God, it would be one figure. If you're, maybe 20%. If you're asking, how many people baptize their children, you would get a higher figure depending on where you are and what region you're in. But again, probably it could be in some places as high as 80%, right? And in other places it could be 30%. So funerals, still up until quite late were largely, religious in some form. So that's one. And then the other side of it, right? The other measure of success And I think what I'm trying to argue in the book, the more important one from the kind of the atheist perspective is, did this project actually create atheists, right? Did it create an atheist society? Did it create people for whom atheism was a central part of their, a guiding principle in their life, right? So because the idea was that religion was supposed to no longer be a guiding principle, but instead atheism was supposed to be a guiding principle. So they did manage to make it so that, or not, I don't want to say they did because that gives too much agency, I think, but it was the case that religion was no longer a guiding principle. But at the same time, atheism did not fill its place, right? It didn't actually come to occupy that role. And so, from that perspective, I think the atheist project absolutely failed. You didn't have kind of people with firm atheist convictions proselytizing atheism to their friends and neighbors, right? I mean, this was not, that would have been success.
Yeah, that's true.
There's so much. There's still so much, and we need to kind of get to the wrapping up. The other things that fascinated me were about things like rapprochement, how they they reconnect with the church during the Second World War, how the bureaucrats, the atheists were basically bureaucrats. Basically, I just want to beg people to read the book because it's fascinating. Is that fair to do? Or just have you talk for a few more hours?
No, I don't think that's the preferable option for anyone.
Oh, darn it. All right. This has really changed my perspective on a lot about the Soviet Union and about processes of secularization.
Well, can I ask you then?
On the one hand,
yeah, go. Because I think that's maybe I had the sense, after kind of talking through and answering the questions, that it's in some fundamental way was a departure from how you understood it. Like it kind of there seemed to come a point when you were like, okay, that's not.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear in what ways, because I think it's really important to see how the story that exists, the kind of, the mythology, let's say, of Soviet atheism parts ways with the history.
Well, I mean, it is weird because I think we are of a different generation, like people who have memories of the Soviet Union and how it was presented in the U.S. versus people who have no concept of it. One of the big things that would get beat into your head all the time was that, oh, they're godless communists.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm starting to think, man, I don't think they were godless at all. They're like, it doesn't sound nearly as godless. Hardly communist if they own the church land. Right. Like they don't like certainly the population. If you're talking about the party, they have an atheist platform, whether or not it's enacted or means anything. But certainly, like, would it be fair to call the Russian people of that time godless?
Well, in the entire Soviet Union, I would say the answer is no. They were not godless or communists. And certainly, if you kind of look at the ideological vision of the ideological apparatus of the party, right? That was the goal, right? Was to have people with firm communist atheist conviction, right? That was the idea. And I talk about this in the book at the end when I talk about, this kind of project that emerges in the 70s of the socialist way of life, right? Which is supposed to be this kind of cultivate a kind of complete picture with socialism or communism and atheism at its center that excludes all competing, and contradictory elements. So that from that perspective, that was certainly the goal of the people whose job it was to do this work. However, it was absolutely not a reality. And if you think about, I think that in terms of this actual term, godless communism, there are two sources for that image that you describe. One is actually the Vatican was a major author of this idea of godless communism, and really saw the Soviet Union as a major threat, including to its interests in that region. Because if you think about, Lithuania, Poland, and so on. So, and then also kind of was trying to create a kind of an alliance, right, with the kind of liberal state, right, that Vatican was doing, by creating this enemy that was a real threat, not just to the religion, but also to the state itself. And so that kind of image coalesces in the 30s, really as a result of the Catholic Church. And then it kind of gets re-articulated and disseminated in a much more robust and powerful way with the beginning of the Cold War. And so the godless communist trope is a Cold War product. It was really kind of, there's a terrific book about this, especially I think as an American, it would be of interest, called The Spiritual Industrial Complex by Jonathan Herzog. But there's other literature on this as well, but basically how religion was mobilized to create consensus in post-war American society. And not only that, but to create a kind of sense of shared mission and purpose, because society was becoming so much more affluent and so much more kind of, had the threat of becoming secular, right? And indifferent to religion, because people were just doing other things, right? Going on vacation and, spending their leisure time in other ways in this kind of post-war affluent society. So this was a way to keep Americans, kind of vigilant and mobilized, right? Was to kind of project this image of godless communism. But for me, what's been interesting about this, and this is connected to other research that I've done and am going to do, is that at the same time that this image of godless communism is coming together in the American imagination and the Western imagination, and it also worth saying is very helpful to fighting communism in Europe after the war, which is a real threat, right? Like in France and Italy, right? So this is a kind of way to mobilize against communism. So, I think that there's a way to kind of to see it as a real, as a really an American invention. And it's because at this time that they're talking about godless communism is exactly the same time that you have this rapprochement with the church in the Soviet Union, where
Yeah.
this regime is actually opening churches, right? They're not closing them, they're opening them. So they go from having about 1,000 to having about 15,000, right, by the end of the Stalin era. So, the godless communist regime is rebuilding and restoring churches, not because they love the church, but because they have managed to neutralize the church as a political opponent and can now use it to their own ends, right? Manage to secularize it, so to speak, right? So I think that the picture is just
and then use the church to support the regime as it exists.
Absolutely. Because by after the Stalin era, or after Stalin's kind of rapprochement with the church is there to support the regime, to support the Soviet state, and more importantly, perhaps its most important function was to do counter propaganda abroad, right? To kind of speak out against this narrative of godless atheism, to disrupt this narrative by, for example, joining the World Council of Churches and making sure that the anti-Soviet decrees don't pass.
Oh, wow.
By saying, there's no religious repression. Look, we're here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, reading the book and then talking with you now, it's a lot more complicated, obviously, than I had previously thought. And also just like the overall power of the Soviet state, that they couldn't do whatever they wanted to. They had to there was that kind of negotiation, I guess, with the population.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I think, and I think this idea that really any state can do whatever it wants without negotiating with the population is a kind of a fiction, if not a delusion, right? You're always dealing with with people who can choose not to go along. I mean, unless unless the Soviet state was literally willing to murder everyone,
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
it had to come to some kind of terms with the population, right?
Yeah.
And if you've murdered everyone, you're not really, a revolutionary state anymore, because there is that you're not leading anyone anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I think, this it's not that somehow makes the repression less awful, because the repression was very much there. It just rounds out the picture in a much more complex way to understand how Soviet power actually functioned, right? That it didn't just function through fear and repression. It actually functioned through accommodations, through cutting deals with certain segments of the population, to achieve ends against other segments of the population. That it was a political regime, right? It wasn't just an ideological regime. It wanted to stay in power. It had political objectives. And that forced compromises that maybe seem peculiar if we are only kind of operating on this ideological construct, right, of godless communism.
There's so many pieces to this narrative, and there's so much that happens. And we could, like, as soon as you pick a thread, it just keeps leading to something else. It's such a fantastic exploration that it doesn't seem to end in richness.
That's really kind of you to say, and I think really nice as a very rewarding to hear as a scholar, because you do work through this material, and it is so complex and nuanced, and to try to convey that without just getting completely lost in the kind of the anarchy and chaos of history, right, is quite complicated. But I think what I think I'm also hearing from you guys, I mean, you guys are running a Beyond Atheism podcast, and what's interesting is that the Soviet Union, occasionally I look up Soviet atheism on Twitter like once a week or so, just to see how it comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look it up, I mean, it is every day somebody is making the same argument that atheism is terrible because of Soviet communism.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
And so it's used, the kind of Soviet atheist kind of trope, right, is used to discredit secularism, atheism, free thought, as a kind of immoral and even murderous project. So I think it's not a trivial thing, how people understand the Soviet Union, because that trope is still kind of used to bludgeon, people
Yeah,
who are, who want to kind of, who identify as
right.
secular.
Yeah. And buried in this, I found that there's the secular argument, or the secularization that occurs seems to somewhat line up with other forms of secularization, where you get progress through urbanization and industrialization.
Oh yeah, Todd, I think that to me was one of the biggest revelations of this entire research project, because as I was thinking through it, reading, for example, Hugh MacLeod's book, right, on the 1960s and the religious crisis, in it, which focuses really primarily on Great Britain, I'm thinking to myself, okay, following the stories in the 60s and 70s, and really, how different is it? Why is it that there's a religious crisis in the West, but there's a kind of atheist crisis, if you will, in the East, right?
Yeah.
That they're all panicking because people, Soviet society isn't atheist enough. In the West,
Right.
it's religious enough, and they think everybody's going to become a Soviet atheist. And in the Soviet Union, they're panicking because it's not atheist enough, and they think that they're all going to become kind of bourgeois consumers. And that religious ideology and institutions are going to somehow infiltrate and weaken Soviet society. So there's a lot of projection that goes into this. And I think I completely agree that there is much more that is similar about these societies by the 60s and 70s than different with regard to kind of worldview, culture, relationships to not just, religion, but kind of, I would say, these kind of frameworks, right, including ideological ones, and especially institutions and authority, right? I mean, they're all really kind of moving away from institutional authority. And I think whether that's in the form of religious institutions or the party, I think what you're seeing is a broader process, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we've gone over an hour. I mean, I wonder if we should probably maybe wrap up.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, there's so much more that we had wrote down to talk about, but yeah.
Well, I suppose people can read the book.
Yes,
Yes.
that's a good
That's-
incentive for them to do that. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
answer. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was amazing.
Mhm.
I think my brain hurts. My mind's been blown a little bit.
I don't know that if that's a good thing, but you know, I tend to hear that sometimes. But thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for taking an interest in the book and in this topic, and you know, for kind of raising these issues and trying to connect the various histories. So thank you so much for having me.
All right. So, what did you think about that interview, Todd?
Another excellent interview, another excellent guest. That book and her work and the depth of her knowledge, it's so dense and so deep. And there's so much that we could pull out of it and so much that we didn't get to. It's a bit overwhelming. But I think a few things that really jumped out at me, and you might have noticed it during the interview, is like that there was a big difference between their attempts at scientific and communistic atheism and the process of secularization. That was big. And one of the things that stood out for me, I don't know how you feel about this, but that idea of getting rid of religious authority, that really rings true with me. Right? Like, I like that aspect of it. What I don't like is the idea that she mentions, she talks about, is that the state needs to capture that authority and use it for its own means. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. That's not the form of atheism any of us envision, is this sort of like state-controlled type.
No. I mean, it's interesting because just that she was saying that, like, officially it was secular in terms of like freedom of religion, the state itself, but then the party was officially atheist, and then the party was running the state, so there was that kind of overlap. I mean, of course, that I think both of us would rather see freedom of religion, and then, like, ideally people would gradually leave religion.
It's having this sort of like state force you to conform. That's not anyone's ideal. But like you were saying, that idea of like how the state, and legally they are secular, and they really did, in her telling of it, they really did function mostly as secular. It reminds me of like the old leftist joke about, leftist observation. Socialists in America used to complain because in America, what socialists are arguing for look nothing like the Soviet Union. And in the US, the American government had to go out of their way to convince everyone that what socialists wanted was the Soviet Union.
Right.
That the Soviet Union is socialism. And ironically, so the joke continues, in the Soviet Union, where they were being in power rested on people believing that this was socialism, they had to convince everybody that the Soviet Union was socialist when it was nothing of the sort.
Yeah, right.
Right? So, and it's the same way with godless communism, where in the US, everyone's saying, oh, God, you can't go there. They can't be like them. They're godless communists. And in the Soviet Union, like, no, we can't have these icons everywhere. We have to be godless communists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah, that's a funny, funny point.
Are there things that we didn't get to that you want to bring up now that we can circle back on? Because there is one of the things that we said it enough times, like her, if you find her book, there's so much more in there. I don't know if she's on Twitter, but
yes, she is.
Definitely find her on Twitter, whatever it is. Seek that out. She's a great font of information. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring into the discussion?
We had meant to talk about this, but like a lot of things, like, we just didn't end up getting to it. But I think the Marxist idea of religion, and obviously the Soviets are informed by what like Karl Marx, the 19th century philosopher, was saying. I mean, like his idea was that religion was like the opium of the people, which meant
Yeah,
like that in
it's a
like really
Tylenol.
brutal conditions, yeah, like you needed the religion was necessary to just sort of get you through it. And then as a socialist system was created, then religion would just naturally wither away.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Because it was
obviously,
the religion is the soul of a soulless world,
yes,
and yeah,
right, yeah, yeah. But then, like, obviously that didn't happen, and obviously, and also that the Soviets were actively trying to get rid of religion. Like they weren't just creating the society then saying like, oh, now religion's going to disappear. Like they were actually taking active steps to make that happen. And while they didn't succeed, obviously, as well.
yeah. So to that end, she uses a fascinating quote by Marx that I'd never seen, and I found the rest of it. The passage is pretty impressive. So it's a real weird distillation of Marx, in his own words, from an interview in, I think it's 1879. And he was asked if he wants to destroy the whole system of religion, root and branch, absolutely eradicate it. And Marx's response is, we know that violent measures against religion are nonsense. But this is an opinion. As socialism grows, religion will disappear. Its disappearance must be done by social development, in which education must play a part. Which is like, it's fascinating in two senses. In the Soviet Union sense, this idea of as religion will disappear, they're kind of doing it backwards, right? They're getting this reverse causation. We need to, like, if we get rid of religion, then we can show that socialism is growing. But the flip side of this is that where we are now, our historical moment, we are seeing across decades of social development, religion is disappearing.
Yeah, that's true.
Religiosity is
Yeah.
disappearing.
Yeah.
We are more educated now, at least certainly in the U.S., than any point in American history, and religion is disappearing.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's clearly playing a part. The way society, the way we have evolved socially, has played a part, and presumably, like, I mean, one of the big topics in political discourse here is like the extent that we will be socialist, right? Or how are we going to get socialized medicine? We just got through a year of the government literally giving people money, right?
Right.
And the argument is that, like, the Republicans are saying, yes, we gave them $5,000, but you want to give them $6,000, and that's too much money because you're socialists. It's crazy that his observation maps on very well to the current environment.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, just in general, like living standards have improved, and things like in many countries in the West that like healthcare is provided, and like there's a social safety net, and even like working conditions have improved, and things like this. I mean, obviously, it's probably not
Yeah.
exactly
Well,
like a
progress
socialist
isn't
regime.
linear. We can go
Yeah.
back and forth.
Hmm.
And, and some people don't believe in progress at all, Nathan. But
Yes, right.
yes, right. There are, things have changed. I mean, there is, and if we consider it social development, certainly. I've got a question for you, Nathan. One thing that the Soviets didn't deal with very well was, or in my mind, they didn't deal with very well, was creating the new sort of ceremonies, creating a meaningful culture, right, around atheism. So they had different holidays. They had the anti-Easter parade,
Right. Yeah.
right, and then now they have the wedding palaces.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think having either like the state or the party or bureaucrats or just a collective group of atheists sort of sit down and hammer out what are religious or irreligious traditions and ceremonies and parties will be like? Or is that something that even needs to be done?
I think it sounds very like, yeah, very cold and bureaucratic. I mean, like, I think you do need to have some ritual. I mean, it was sort of funny because she was talking about how it used to be like to get married or something, like you would go into this government office and like you would just sign a book, and
Sign a
behind you
book.
was someone getting
Yeah.
divorced and so on. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, for me, I think one of the things that gives rituals meaning is like that there's a long tradition of people in the past having done it as well. And I mean, I feel like one doesn't need to completely reject any religious rituals. I mean, I mean, in terms of like, obviously you may not,
But you're not.
you wouldn't agree like with the sort of any religious aspects of it, but nonetheless, like you still do it. I mean, like I think we touched on another one about like having a Christmas tree or something like that, or I mean, yeah, whatever. I mean,
Well, yeah. Christmas tree is a great example because that's not really, it doesn't really have anything to do with Christmas, right?
no, right,
That's
that's true, right,
appropriation from
yeah,
other holidays. It's
yeah,
appropriation of pagan rituals, like
yeah,
Easter,
that's true.
right? Like, why do we have an 8-foot German rabbit coming to our house to deliver
Yes.
chocolate, right? Like, that's clearly has nothing to do with the birth of Christ.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's
So
true.
all of these are like, yeah, so I agree with you. And it made me think about things like, well, what does an atheist wedding look like? And having been to very religious weddings and been to completely irreligious weddings, they're almost identical, right? Like if you came down from Mars and were studying human ceremonies, you wouldn't notice a difference between them. They have the exact same patterns, they have the exact same things, except one is in a house of worship and one is at a Denny's or something. That's an exaggeration. One is at one is at a different place. It's at a golf course or something, or a wedding hall, right? But you follow these same patterns because it's appropriated and it's changed sufficiently, right? You move one piece here and change one piece there, and it's almost like evolution. And so it makes me think that as atheists, we don't need to burn it all down. Like we can just take it and make it our own. Like Christmas is not like people bitch about keeping Christ in Christmas and it's complete bullshit. All right, like if you're complaining because someone at Walmart didn't wish you a Merry Christmas
Right.
when you bought a 56-inch television, right? Like you're out of your you've totally lost the connection between the two events. So, okay, here's a little bit of background. I'm from Massachusetts. Massachusetts literally banned Christmas years ago. Do you
Like
know why they banned Christmas?
is it like the Puritans or the
Yeah,
Pilgrims?
they banned Christmas because they're Christians.
Right,
You
right.
can't have a party on Christ's birthday. Don't be ridiculous.
Yeah.
That man died for you, right? That was God killing himself. So the idea that like it's a few things like this unbroken chain of tradition from the past until now is ludicrous, and I don't want a bureaucrat somewhere telling me. I want to be that bureaucrat telling people how to have an atheist birthday party, right? I think it's complete. One of the lessons I take away from this is appropriation is completely okay. As long as we have something that's ours and is godless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like it needs to be sort of bottom up, as they say, rather than top down. Yeah,
exactly. Right. We create it by doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. One other thing I want to add quick, and we can get to the wrap up. She mentioned it. I had this stunning memory hit me the other day after the interview when she was talking about how the state owned all the church property and would rent it back to them, and then one day they could just close it down. And it's galling if you know that that's the state doing that. But she pointed out that like for most of the parishioners, the lay people, they didn't know, right? It's just you go to church one day and it's closed. I was home in my hometown in Massachusetts a few years ago and drove by an old beautiful church and it was for sale. And I asked my father, like, what happened there? It's like, oh yeah, they shut it down, they're selling it. Like, well, why did they close it down? It's like, I don't know, maybe not, people not going. It's only old people anyway.
Right.
But it's the same. That's the same sense that you get, right? What's the difference on a certain level? If you don't have that knowledge of why it's occurring, just know that that church is shutting down. There's a weird disconnect from the power that's behind it, and I can understand how you could be disconnected from that and not understand it. Although in Massachusetts, they were selling the land to raise money because the priest raped children. So let's keep that in mind.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's pretty easy to overlook.
Right. Yes.
But anyway, on that happy note, by the way, everybody, any complaints about this, just write Nate.G.Alexander at Twitter.
Yeah. That's close enough to my actual Twitter handle. Yeah.
What's the Twitter handle?
It's Nate Nath G. Alexander, I guess.
Nath
Yeah.
G. Alexander.
Yeah.
No dots.
No dots. No, but that might be
I
some
think you can
other
tell from that.
hapless person.
Let's see. There's Nathag. Poor Nathag Alexander.
Yeah.
Or Nathan Galexander. He's
Yes.
getting bombarded with all this
Yeah. No, that's
atheist
true.
hatred.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's obvious. I'm not on the Twitter. Don't worry about that. Anything else we need to promote? Anything coming up?
No, just to like and subscribe and rate and review and et cetera, et cetera.
Ring the bell.
Yes.
Ring the bell. Pull the string. Feed the dog. Whatever you need to do.
Yeah. I think yeah. One
big ups.
Yeah.
Thank yous to Red Japan. Nailed it again. And that's it. That's all I got.
Yes. All right. See everyone next time.